Okay, okay. Mhm. Okay, yeah, today, my forum, okay, our forum marks the 119th, okay, since we started our forum 2000, maybe March or April, the pandemic, okay, uh, uh, the outbreak, okay. Uh, we are set for 2 hour session that promises to be both engaging and insightful. Our focus today is the upcoming 2024 US presidential election with the theme, the 2024 United States presidential election, understanding the process and the possible outcomes. With the election just around the corner on November 5th, okay, very imminent, okay, its results are expected to have far-reaching global implications. We are truly honored to have Dr. Marco Gopin as our guest speaker today. Dr. Gopin is the James H. Rao Professor of World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution, and the Director of the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution at the George Mason University's Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. In today's session, Dr. Gopin will share his insights on how the election could shape both domestic and international landscapes, addressing critical issues such as political polarization, disinformation, and the broader impact on global affairs. He also looks forward to a lively discussion and encourages you to bring your questions and comments for a dynamic exchange. We are also fortunate to have Professor Dr. Vasilin Popovsky, originally from Bulgaria, as today's moderator. Dr. Popovsky is a valued member of our Global Thursday Forum steering committee and a regular participant in our forum. He is the senior advisor at the International Institute for Higher Education and Research, as well as Vice Dean of Jindal Global Law School in India. Dr. Gopin will present for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will open the floor for discussion and a Q&A session. I encourage everyone to participate actively. Now, I'm pleased to hand this microphone over to Dr. Popovsky.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tung Ho Khan. And yes, as you mentioned, 119 meeting. I admire your energy and your effort and enthusiasm to keep us together for so long, for all those now almost five years. And also I have the pleasure and privilege to introduce our new speaker, Professor Dr. Marc Gopin, who is James Law Professor of World Religion, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution in the Carter School of the J. Mason University. Looking at your CV, Marc, you really impress with your long time work on conflict resolution, on peace building, engagement in various conflict zones. So I'm sure we will bring you again into this group to talk about those conflicts and how they can be solved. That's another big topic. But today, we are very happy to hear from you on something which is kind of a short term and emerging. The next 2 weeks, everybody in the world will be watching the news, the final days of the presidential campaigns, and which somehow everywhere in the world is considered to be crucial. The moment of decision is vital. First of all, because the global situation is quite challenging and divided, and always such a big power as the United States does matter. In fact, who will be the candidate that will take the presidency from January 20 next year, 2025. So we are very happy and very curious to learn more about the process of the presidential elections in the United States generally, which is kind of unique. I don't think any other country in the world spent almost 2 years in presidential campaigning. Usually in my country, it's about 3 weeks. In some countries, the elections go almost unnoticed. But in the United States, for 2 years, effectively immediately after the midterm elections in the Congress in 2022, already all the attention moves to the next presidential elections. It's really long, and it's really very interesting and very sometimes controversial. So I won't say any more now. We are all ready to listen from you, Dr. Marc Gopin, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. It's very much an honor to be here. I hope my voice is projecting well enough
Yes,
for
yes.
people to
Yeah.
hear. Very
Great.
good. I just want to preface this and put some frames. First of all, I immediately fell in love with Hong Kong
Mhm.
when I started. I don't always pay attention to who's winning a Nobel Prize, but I was curious, and so I just read a little, and then I read more, and then I read more, and I was just intoxicated by the uniqueness and the universality of her perspective on the intrapsychic reality that is so important to my work. The work of analysis and conflict resolution that we do is very much psychosocial. It's very much intrapsychic, and it's very much about even the neuroscience of the way in which the brain is operating and how it's affected by the world around it. And the best writers in history are really truly the greatest psychologists of history. And so you see within her that incredible capacity that's at the same time a lens onto a region. And yet you don't feel as if you're reading only a South Korean. You feel like you're reading humanity when you read her portrayals of people and their inner lives. And so I was very struck by that.
Mhm.
Um, and then something you said, Professor Sung Ho, um, you said that there's increasing tensions in the region that are going to be affected by the American election. Well, I've come to question what we think is increasing or decreasing. I am not certain anymore, given the experience, the unbelievably traumatic experience that we're going through in terms of information and elections in the United States, with a fantastic amount of money being poured in to disinform, to confuse, to despair. Uh, I'm not sure what's increasing and increasing in terms of tension because so much of our global information system now is a highly sophisticated manufactured one, not by some sophisticated dark force in the world, but by many, many forces that are actively using information and disinformation to push their agenda, to engage in cyber warfare that defeats adversaries and competitors from within. It's a very confusing time to know exactly what is reality. And that makes the world of the individual and the wise individual that much more important. So I'll begin with a very strange thing. There's a brilliant mass seller of books globally. His name is Yuval Harari. And Harari is a historian, and historians have a very critical role to play when you don't know what is reality. Yeah, there it is. Nexus, yes, that's one of his many books. And I rely very much on Heather Cox Richardson, who's one of the great American historians and who's been writing and writing. And if you don't have the context of history, you can be swayed by so many different falsehoods that you think are erupting right now. And then you look at the patterns of history and you see whether this is a pattern, whether this is a disruption, or whether it's completely fake. So Yuval, for example, just recorded the fact that for centuries and centuries, European culture had the phenomenon of witchcraft. Witchcraft is ancient. The idea of women having special intuitive abilities, spiritual abilities to predict the future, to help people with their problems. It's tens of thousands of years old. He said the only time there became a witch hunt and a conspiracy and the burning of witches, which was a massive phenomenon that even reached my beloved Boston. My beloved Boston in the 1600s was burning witches or hanging them right a couple of miles from me in Boston Common. Bostonians don't like to admit that. Right up in Salem, the Salem witch trials. And Yuval comes along as the great historian and says, wait a second. People didn't used to do that. It's not medieval. It's not something to do with old-fashioned crazy people. It's the printing press. It was a grand conspiracy of the time that wanted to deflect from theft and injustice and all sorts of problems of distribution of wealth. And it deflected onto women and onto witches as the source of all of our problems. And then throughout Europe and in the United States, they burned witches at the stake. So that's relevant because we have systems of so-called elections globally now that are being infected by disinformation systems that are very purposely deflecting people from being able to engage in issues where often they are not as far apart as they appear to be. They often have policy differences, but often based on very little knowledge of which way might be better and what is the exact history of the experiments with more taxes, with less taxes, with conversion to electricity over gasoline. All of these things are very complicated, but it's very, very easy to confuse and despair. And so coming to our elections now, there's never been a time in history in all of my work in politics and analysis of Washington where I have seen so many people completely giving up on information and ignoring dozens and dozens of polls because the polls are now a propaganda tool. It was recently discovered that everybody was concerned about polls in the last few weeks alone. And it turned out that 12 out of the 14 polls that were being presented in public as polls were actually propaganda tools. And so, once again, for 3 or 4 weeks, there was panic about a certain kind of poll in many states. And it turns out that 12 of those 14 had political funds behind them in order to confuse and contradict and despair, because there is a purpose to getting people not only to believe to not to not vote. In other words, voting has become one of the central most controversial issues in history. If young people and women are not voting as frequently as others, if minorities in your countries are not voting as frequently as others do, then it is in the interests of at least one party that is catering to them, or many parties, to get them to the voting stations, to get them to have ease of voting. I, for example, voted weeks ago already because my ballot came in the mail because I happen to be in the state of Maryland registered to vote. So every American is registered, has to be registered in a state because the states still control a great deal of your life and your power in the United States. And therefore, every state is making different rules about how easy it is or how hard it is for you to vote. And so Maryland is a blue state, which means it's been dominated for a fairly long time by Democrats, except the governor has been a liberal Republican for a long time. So you really can only be a more liberal kind of Republican to be governor of Maryland. His name is Logan. And so he's been running advertisement about how committed he is to reproductive women's rights, which is a signal issue for women who are entering the voting force and as young women, but also many women who are energized now because they're terrified of the destruction of reproductive rights and the advocacy by the most radical elements of the president and the former president and his vice presidential candidate to make pregnancy tests, for example, in some states are advocating that women would have to go across state lines would have to have a pregnancy test in order to prevent them from doing an abortion in another state. So that would be the beginning of the end of a democratic right to not be arrested, for example. So to be arrested for being pregnant and not and crossing state lines is the end of women's right to move freely, the freedom of movement. It's basic to democracy. So many things are terrifying a number of women to vote disproportionately, especially if they're younger, for one party. And then there are desperate efforts to prevent them from voting in various states that are not like Maryland, but are like Georgia, for example. And in Georgia, and this is just helping you get into the weeds of this, which is really complicated. The state of Georgia had the Republican Party there try to make a rule that you could only hand count all of the votes. And so if they had passed that, and if the law had affirmed that in the courts, then effectively many of Georgia's votes would have never been counted in time to count for the election. So one of the ways in which people's voting is trying to be suppressed is by introducing laws wherever they can be found to make it harder to count the votes. And particularly if it's hand counted, it's subject to more prejudices. So that, for example, if there are many all black neighborhoods, perhaps they'll send only one vote counter. But to an all white neighborhood, they'll send 20 vote counters, you see. And then suddenly you'll see a tabulation in Georgia going up for Mr. Trump because they only sent enough counters to the white neighborhoods to elect Mr. Trump. And they didn't send hardly any to the white. They had many efforts to prevent the distribution. There are states that outlawed the distribution of food and water to people waiting online at underserved polling stations where poor people had to stand for 8 hours to get their vote in. And then they made a state law to make it illegal to give them food and water online. So you see that there's an incredible amount of machinations going on at the state level, depending on who is in charge in that state. So we have a broad civil conflict, an ongoing civil conflict in the United States for at least 40 years now. We think, I mean, this is the most extreme choice in American history. But this 40-year struggle of who counts for votes, actually, it may be that it's from the 1850s, 1860s, when officially um, blacks got the vote. And then later, when women got the vote, there has been a reaction to make it as hard as possible for them to vote, assuming they were going to vote for one party, for a particular party. So this has been a grand American struggle for almost since its inception in terms of how to either enable everyone to vote or to prevent as many people as possible from voting. It should be stated, and it has to be understood, and this is extraordinary, is that for 40 years now, the Republican Party has not won a single election based on the national number of people voting. They have lost every single election, and yes, they've held on to the presidency consistently because of something we'll talk about now called the Electoral College. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, but we'll get to it in a second. So basically, numerically speaking, it's pretty likely that Vice President Harris will win the popular vote, it's called, the national popular vote, by maybe as much as 70% over 30%, which from a political point of view is extraordinary. Hillary Clinton won a landslide victory on the popular vote, but never became president. Okay, so the difference, for example, with Mr. Obama and why he got 8 years in office is the fact that he won in every single state enough to get a majority of the electoral college. And he had a special skill to be, and this was before the age of massive disinformation that we have now, which is unique and unprecedented in its scope and scale, and the outside money pouring in to make that happen. But Mr. Obama had a special charisma and a special capacity with even the most conservative states and their electoral and their voting. So he won in those so-called swing states. There are at least 8 swing states, including Pennsylvania and Michigan and several others, Arizona, Nevada. Some of them go blue, some of them go red. My own state, where my university is, used to be red. Now it's blue because of the excessive volume of Northern Virginians who are more college educated. So basically, college educated votes tend to be more on the blue side, on the Democratic side, or on the liberal side, and non-college educated tends to be on the Republican side. So the volume of votes in Virginia started to turn towards a blue state, but it has been a swing state. It has a very right-wing Republican governor at the present time, Glenn Youngkin, and these things swing, and they have these different sways, and each state has their own House of Representatives in addition to to the governor who runs things. So this is a very, very complex operation that boils down to each and every state and the amount of electoral votes they have to constitute a majority to win the elections. And that's at least 270 electoral votes. Those electoral votes, those electoral votes are hotly contested. They differ state to state depending on the population of that state. So they are tabulated based on population. That too has been a subject of great legal controversy because the states, truly states like California, outnumber almost all states in the union. And those states are heavily populated by people who within the last 3 generations have come to the United States from South America and Central America. And that too is a source of rage in the identity-based politics that Mr. Trump has specialized in. In the United States, just like all over Europe and many places in the world, as you well know, when there are when there are policies being implemented that are for very wealthy and powerful people, what's beneficial to them in terms of taxes or in terms of less legal oversight of business, very often the the party that is advocating for those very wealthy interests are very interested in dividing and conquering people by their identities, by their color of their skin, by the difference of their religion. And this is a pattern globally. It is a great weakness of rational governance that is embedded in the whole problem of making democracy dependent upon elections, that masses and mobs of people have always been very easily subject to rumors and disinformation, particularly when there's a vested interest in distracting them from their interests to the limbic system through to the amygdala, to the baser emotions of fear, of jealousy, of suspicion, of conspiracy, that's in the base of the brain. So instead of focusing on policy, which is in your neocortex, there is a deliberate effort in many places long before to divide people by race, to divide people by religion, to divide people by tribe, and then to have the elections determined by a group that's interested and benefits from those divisions. That is what's happening writ large here now. But there is an unprecedented level of the uses of disinformation systems to keep that going in a much more sophisticated way, with millions and millions of dollars being poured into Twitter and being poured into Facebook and other places. Facebook has pushed back. So Meta is at odds with Russian interference, but Twitter has given full home to millions of accounts that are fake in order to create these kind of swarms of bots that appear to be popular and appear to be indigenous. And they're doing two things, but mostly they're pitting Americans against each other. They even were caught on Facebook years ago actually making demonstrations in Los Angeles on two sides of a policy issue. In other words, the bots in a Russian troll farm, it's called, succeeded in getting demonstrators to go against each other in Los Angeles on both sides of an issue. Because the goal of that disinformation campaign is not to make a country look good. Like, for example, China spends a lot of money on American elections too, but their basic goal is to make China look better, which is your standard public diplomacy, looking good. And it's not, gee, how can I make Americans as psychologically confused and as upset as possible? I'm going to make them not know what is true and what is not true. And I'm also going to encourage multiple sides of conflicts to go at each other and demonize each other. So I'm actually going to be funding super left-wing things and super right things in order to make it a despairing process that democracy itself is not worth it. And so we've come to a point where many, many Americans have heard a candidate say that you vote for me and you'll never have to vote again, that I will use the military on day one, on my enemies, on the people who are not with us. These are actual statements from a presidential candidate in the United States. It's never been, in all of American history, there's never been statements that I will go after my enemies with the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, with the military on day one, or the implication that I will never leave office. So these are unprecedented. No one, no conservative candidate, not Woodrow Wilson, not George Bush, no one has ever said that. Not even George Wallace, who was pretty firm racist, from KKK origins, never said that he would never leave office. This is a proposal for the end of democracy. And you have to ask yourself why at this moment in history are so many Americans ready to accept that. And there has been this is an indictment of American education, an indictment of an inability to protect oneself from disinformation, where other countries in the Baltics, for example, and in many countries in the world, there is education about disinformation. The United States has been left in a very dark state of unpreparedness for critical thinking and critical decision making and telling fact from fiction, in addition to a massive onslaught of very sophisticated disinformation, where even I can tell you, I'm writing. I'm part of a group, an interfaith group that's writing editorials, and they're very sophisticated, advanced people, professors, theologians. They are saying that they have assumed that most everything they're reading is disinformation. So that's a very astonishing evolution. It's at the same time that there's a great loss of faith in the major news outlets that appear to be doing what many other companies are doing, which is that shareholders have now become the main clients as opposed to readers. And therefore, shareholders may have an interest in keeping elections razor thin. So there's great profits to be made if to the last minute everybody around the world has to wait up and anticipate for months what's going to be the fate of the United States and its effect on them. And so that's great profits in that, to create that suspense. The other thing we should talk about is implications before I close. And that is the implications cannot be more stark in terms of the continuation of basically Mr. Biden's policies, a kind of robust commitment to American geopolitical relationships with other democracies, with their present alliances, versus a kind of reversal of all of that, and an abandonment of NATO, an abandonment of geopolitical alliances, and a robust embrace of Russian interests. And that has happened before, and it will happen if this election goes that way. The other reality is that the election may it may lead to a no decision, because if the strategy has also been to contest in advance all elections, so that it goes to either the Supreme Court, which is heavily focused on a pro-Trump group of Supreme Court justices at this point, or to the House of Representatives, and to the vice president, the sitting vice president. So as of now, we simply don't know how much violence there could be in terms of the refusal to accept the elections. The vice president the candidates, the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party and the presidential candidate of the Republican Party have both said that they never accepted the 2020 elections, no matter how much they were verified, and they will not accept these elections if it doesn't go their way. So this is a very serious situation on the level of American civil conflict and civil war. The United States military is heavily, at this point, opposed to the use of the military for force and for forcing the American government into the hands of one party or the other. They're very opposed. They happen to be filled with chiefs of staff and generals who are PhD educated, and they tend to General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Trump, has said that he is the most dangerous man in American history, that he is a fascist. That's General Milley, who is his chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the highest military position. What is more worrisome is that on January 6th, when Mr. Trump engaged in a coup against the House and injured thousands of police, there were hundreds of police that were in the crowd of the insurrection. And so when you go across the United States to local areas, there are over 350, 400 million guns in the country. There's well-trained people in militias and police forces that are very adept at using guns. It's the most gun infested country in the world by far. But gun violence, without politics, gun violence has gone down by 30% in the last 7 years. So there is a lot of success in policing and evolution of policing and evolution of dealing with crime. But on the political level, the astonishing willingness of a presidential candidate and a president at the time to tell his people to attack is unprecedented in history. Mrs. Pelosi, the most powerful woman in the country and the greatest threat to this former president, is Nancy Pelosi. And he encouraged the crowds to attack and severely beat and hospitalize her husband. And he is still saying that the Pelosi's are enemy number one. You know, she's an old lady now, and her husband was attacked and almost murdered with a hammer by one of his followers, and he's still obsessed with the Pelosi's, that they have to be executed. So this is a very, very serious situation that Americans have never faced before. There are many non-democratic countries that have faced these kind of candidates, but it's something that's taken many people by surprise to such a degree that they don't want to believe it. Even the right-wing governor of Virginia, who I think is very radical, but he's basically a decent guy. They showed him being interviewed 2 days ago by a reporter saying, this is exactly what Mr. Trump said. And this is the quote from something. I'm going to play you the tape. And he refused to accept that that was what Mr. Trump said, that Mr. Trump actually said that he would execute his enemies. So there's a denial that is very important for us as scholars to think about in terms of the history of fascism. And this comes to obedience studies of Stanley Milgram going back many decades. We need to understand that the human being is capable of great reasoning, great compassion, great altruism, but also abnormal levels of obedience when people in power tell them to say or think or do something. And that it takes a lot more sophisticated education for us to defend ourselves against the ability of people to follow a strongly well-funded a criminal intentionality. It is not something that the scholarly community and the community of analysts have fully coped with, because all we do is develop the neocortex and develop analytical abilities, and we assume that everybody's just going to follow suit because we have our good statistics and our good teaching. But we are not understanding the age of the bot, the age of disinformation, the age of cybersecurity. So I come back to what I said before to Dr. Sungho, is that before we rush to say there's increase in tensions on the Korean Peninsula, let's just look at the facts. Just try to find them beneath the news cycle and see what is really going on and how much are political leaders reacting to what they think is reality because the cycle is saying it's reality. So this is a very interesting and important way in which we need much more intense relations between adversaries. We need our competitors. So, for example, there are all sorts of unresolved issues and hurts around the world, between Muslims and Hindus in India, between Japanese civilians and Korean civilians. There's many things that in my field we say are very important and we should be working on with millions of people. And it's worth the investment to stabilize democracy, to stabilize capitalism, to stabilize business, to invest in those relationships. And most important of all, that the leaders not be tempted by sowing these differences and that they have constant communications. This can work. The proof is that we never went to the level of a complete nuclear destruction of the world. That the Soviet leaders and the American leaders, despite the severe problems of the Cold War and the fronts everywhere, had a level of communications that managed through what could have been and should have been the end of human civilization. And they did it with deep communications. And this is where we need to work on intellectually what are the ways in which our religions, our cultures, our political systems, and our political leaders, and our educational leaders, and our business leaders will become a web that is more impervious to disinformation and manipulation. My own field that I've worked on for 30 years, 40 years, is the determination in various parts of the world for religion to be taken out of the abuse of religion for the sake of military gain or foreign policy, as a weapon of foreign policy. We all saw 9/11. We all saw the consequences. We know what this is. And on all sides, from especially the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, these religions are weaponized or were weaponized and still are by many. And we have reached a level with leaders to make it much harder to do that now, except that we still have rogue regimes like Taliban and Yemen Houthis and others that still do that. But we have a much more global consensus. We need one on disinformation. We need one on the anti, on protecting elections and democracy from information, disinformation, and manipulation. And that's our big conclusion from where we are sitting right now at this very volatile moment in human history. So I think that's about 40 minutes, and I
Yes.
don't want to take over my time too much. And I'll stop there, even though I didn't really address everything. So I'm assuming that in questions you'll ask me what I forgot to talk about.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Professor Marc Gopin. It was really brilliant. You touch on, as you say, too many issues to address in one session. I'm reading now Yuval Harari Nexus. I'm also very much concerned with the disinformation campaigns. For me, Ronald Reagan and George Bush at the time were my icons. I was living in a communist Bulgaria in the 1980s. I protested against the communism. We wanted the change that it's same. Fascism and communism have no difference. These are totalitarian regime based on the same premise of refusal of democracy, refusal of independent media, refusal of independent judiciary, and all of that. So for me, Reagan and George Bush were the icons of freedom, rule of law, respect of human rights, and we all in Bulgaria, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia followed those Republican presidents. And somehow, paradoxically, when Bill Clinton became a president, we were a bit disappointed because he was kind of a arrogant, sexist, elitist. And at those days, 40 years ago, 35, 30 years ago, everybody, well, in my circle at least, the majority of the Bulgarians are very strongly supporting the Republican Party. And on the opposite, the Democrats somehow, in the first years of Bill Clinton, disappointed us. So for me, it's really unbelievable how that same Republican Party, which we all admire 30 years ago, for 3 consecutive elections in 2016, in 2020, and now in 2024, cannot find a better candidate to become a president than Donald Trump. I really ask myself this every day. Okay, you are right. We understand that people can be manipulated. Yuval Harari explained very well the process of manipulation through the media, through the stories that are created and falsified. But I ask the question how the party, the Republican Party, it is supposed to be the emanation of history. It doesn't start with Ronald Reagan. We can go back to Lincoln and to previous presidents. How that party for 3 consecutive elections cannot find a better candidate. That's my question, and I will give also time to my colleagues here to continue asking. And please, let's have at least 1 or 2 more intervention, and then you can take the floor again. Who else wants to say something from? Let me see if I see everybody who is raising hands. Yes, I open my screen. Yes, please, colleagues, just unmute and introduce yourself and ask your question if I don't see anybody. Don't be shy, just please unmute yourself and take the floor. Who wants to follow up with another? I don't see. So, Marc, why don't you try to explain my query about the Republican Party, and then we move to the next one.
Okay.
Sure. Well, in a nutshell, there's been a number of books and research on what's called the imperial presidency, or the evolution of the United States into the United States has 3 branches of government. And it's supposed to have an independent judiciary and an independent legislature of House and Senate, and an independent presidency and White House. In the last 100 years, there's been an emerging evolution of the White House and the presidency, therefore taking over government more and more and more and dominating the process of leadership. One of the great weaknesses of democracy is that concentration of power has a logic of its own, and it increases as time goes on. And there hasn't been a good way to keep that in check, particularly because the United States is probably the most robust capitalist country on earth. And the amount of money, I was just listening to Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is one of the richest men in history. He's a passionate patriot of the United States. He lives very, very modestly himself in the same middle class house and $100,000 salary. But he has, 30, $40 billion, whatever. He's one of the richest men. And he is not happy that trickle down economics, which the same Ronald Reagan, who was a great champion of the defeat of communism, released Americans of the 50s and 1950s, 60s, and 70s from 70, 80% taxation on the wealthiest to something that went way, way down. And there was great, as the United States accrued massive wealth to the top, it did not trickle down, and it put power in many, many billionaires to start investing in who the next president will be. And that was had to be a focus of bipartisan commitment. So over the last many decades, it has become a bipartisan problem of the imperial presidency. And so much so that basically there are now a vast number of millionaires who are in the House and Senate of the United States, where I used to deal with a very, very liberal Republican man with the name of Amo Houghton, who was the only millionaire just in my life, just in the last 20 years. And now money controls so many elections across the country, and especially the imperial presidency. That has made that has changed the both parties into parties that are easily more bought without, frankly. And so Mr. Trump, who actually began with a practice on television. So it started evolving more into TV personalities because personality becomes more important than policy. The more money that you have and the more that your agenda is to get even more money for the wealthiest 400 people in the country. And Mr. Trump excelled at TV personality, at mass manipulation, and also at something that we still need to understand on a psychosocial and neuroscience level. And that is the power of any system, even monarchy, to function well decade after decade, constitutional monarchies, until somebody is born into royalty who is a narcissistic personality, who is incapable of any kind of feelings other than for themselves. And that can poison any system. And he developed an ability to bully and gaslight people on television that became hypnotic and toxic to the system of communications. He simply destroyed every other Republican candidate. Each one of them he humiliated into defeat. And the Republican Party was not prepared to put a stop to it. They simply couldn't resist the amount of money he had. They couldn't resist his ability to bully. They couldn't resist his ability to be a great TV star. Reagan had set the model. I also want to say to you, I mean, I really sympathize with you, Professor, because I think that I have been lifelong more progressive, and when I was growing up, we really didn't understand how wrong it was to not appreciate that anti-communism was not just the distortion of it to that there were people suffering under communism across the world, and that the liberal Democrats were just focusing on America's illegal wars in South America or Vietnam, and they didn't think, what about the big picture? What about all those people suffering? And so they became apologists for the communist world, and that discredited them. That was a righteous kind of position of the Republican Party. But what I'm saying is that it got infected with a centralization of presidency and personality and wealth that made it impossible for them to defeat Donald Trump. Each one of the candidates said he is a dangerous man with narcissistic personality disorder, Paul Ryan, all the others, and he smashed every one of them because the system does not have the checks and balances right now, and most of democracy does not have the ability right now to deal with this level of hatred and fascism. And now a lot of us are more humble about what happened to Germany, for example. We're not as assuming that something was wrong with Germans, because we see now that there are certain kind of personalities that come along that defeat all liberal and conservative positions, if you know what I'm saying.
Right.
Okay.
Quick follow-up. Do you think Kamala Harris can be a different president, no longer an imperial president? She has a very different background, and she presents herself as someone who was in a poor neighborhood. Yes, her
Well, honestly,
biography looks very, very different from everybody since Ronald Reagan.
I think she's a fabulous candidate, but I say to you that this is a structural problem that needs bipartisan intervention because Mr. Obama also came. He was very educated, but he understood the ground, and it's just irresistible. He goes in with almost no money. Now he's worth maybe 50, 80, $100 million. Senator McConnell is now worth 50 to $100 million. It's an irresistible system at this point. Mr. Biden has stayed as humble as he began, but this is not an easy. The role of wealth in the imperial presidency is something that we need a bipartisan fix to, especially because we need to distance ourselves from the possibility of dictatorship. And there aren't enough constitutional protections in the United States legal system now against fascism. And I assure you that if she does win, there will be a lot of legislation bipartisan to try and prevent some of the things that led to this possibility.
I agree with that, although when Donald Trump attempted to challenge the last election in 2020, and he filed about 50 plus challenges, all those judges throughout the various states, and some of them, by the way, selected by the Republicans, dismiss Donald Trump attempt to overrule the result of the 2020 election. So for me, at least, that was a signal that the institutions still work. They still can stop Donald Trump from challenging the 2020 elections, even if a lot of those judges were Republican or appointed by the Republicans, and they didn't follow. They kept their independence in the judiciary, and they found no evidence, and they dismissed.
Well, yeah, and let me just say that there are vote counters. There are people in charge of counting votes in every state in the union. Most of them are Republican, and their lives are being threatened every day. So, does the system work? Yes, but it's under assault, and that assault needs legislative intervention. For example, there should be a law that if you have been involved in a coup against the United States government, you're disqualified from future running the future elections for Senate, for Congress, for the presidency. That's a very simple bipartisan commitment that has nothing to do with whether you're conservative or liberal. It should be an assumption, a logical assumption, but nobody ever made a law like that because nobody ever imagined it.
Yeah,
it was a very
unprecedented situation, and yeah.
Right, the party of the military, the party that was so up on the United States military is now a party that's attacking the military every day because bullying them into being part of this coup. So again, we need legislation, we need creativity in firming up the legal structures of democracy. And I think democracy is an ongoing project of humanity. And everywhere it needs always to be flexible and moving to the next stage of deepening it.
I cannot agree more. And indeed, again, going back 30 years ago, I remember those days when Francis Fukuyama wrote the book of End of History. We were very optimistic, and we were thinking that liberalism and democracy has taken over the world once and forever. There will never be ever more ideologies such as fascism. But we were wrong. See, only in a short period of time of 20 years since those days, we experienced something unbelievably, you know. But the countries that impressed us most in Eastern Europe, Hungary and Poland, were like the leaders to follow for the rest of the Eastern Europe. Today, Poland and Hungary are also run by governments that are very dictatorial, anti-rule of law, and they could be really step backs. It's not a straightforward road to democracy. Democracy
Yes.
needs to be defended every day, every
That's right.
hour, every minute. Otherwise, it could go away. Okay, I'm turning to my colleagues for the next intervention. Who wants to ask questions?
May I?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Go.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Gopin. Still, because I am not a specialist in American politics, compare with the Korean Korean election is, we call it direct, voting. Okay, all members participate. So after, the voting, when we count who is the largest, okay, the voter, I mean who won this election, who wins this election means who have more voting. Okay, it depends. But the American election system is like electoral voting system is quite a somewhat difficult. I mean, even though you have the candidate, the gained more. Voting, but you cannot, you are not sure of the result, right? It depends on each state. Okay, so would you explain a little more like this system? Who are the winner? I mean this kinds of a voting system. And second one is the particularly the two candidates this time is very controversial. I mean, the very contrast, okay, two different candidates. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, okay. Would you give us, I approximately know their, characteristics or some strengths or some, right, just some weak points or something. Would you highlight the key differences between the two potential candidates? And one more thing is in American history, so far no female president, okay, has existed. So and this is I think the second candidate as far as I remember after Hillary Hillary, and this Kamala Harris, she has a little different the background from the Hillary. I mean, she has like what African orient, origin, Southeast origin migration, and she's like approach is quite a different, and the old policies. So also in America, I mean how about still the people in the what do they think of the female candidates? I mean, it's like America is like acting as a global police and the kinds of empire, and the people cannot trust the female leadership. Okay, I wonder if it could be possible. I know, like Korea, Japan, still I think we are still the like Confucius influencer. Okay, so it's a kinds of like male-dominated society traditionally. So could it be some people might afraid of female leadership? How could you, control this leadership? Particularly in Korea, we need strong leadership or something. So is there the influenced by the people's conception about the sexes, different gender or something. Okay, that is my question.
Very, very good. Let me just begin with what you asked about the Electoral College. The Electoral College has about 538 total votes in the country per state. So the states, it depends on how many people the state has. So for example, Montana has, I think, 3 or 4 electoral votes out of 538, not very much. But California has 54. There are um, there are Massachusetts only has 11, but New York has an outsized number in 28. Texas has 40.
Mm.
Um, Basically, you have to cobble together winning in each state by majority, and then all those votes in principle go into one pocket. Okay, so it doesn't matter how many. So, the national vote can be won, but you lose the elections because you didn't get up to the magical number of 270, which would be the majority of the electoral college. So it means that you have to fight the election in every single state. Now, on a certain level, people thought of the Electoral College as a very stabilizing element within American democracy. If you think about it, the whole idea from the beginning was to have one country out of many, many states. And this way, every state has a powerful role in the future of the country. And so that you can't ignore the people in Arkansas and just go ahead because they don't have very many people. So, in theory, it sounds like the Electoral College would have a stabilizing influence on the United States and therefore not because everybody's represented. That's true to some degree. I think there has been an avoidance of a civil war kind of thing between red states and blue states because of that. However, there's been a movement of many states, and I think it's up to 196 electoral votes, that the state has decided by law that whoever wins the state, um, that, how is it? That the electoral college would be divided based on the number of people that voted each way. In other words, they're trying to attenuate, to lessen the impact of the state and emphasize how people are voting. The other thing that's happened that's problematic is that it also means that um, identity based politics is the way we frame it in the United States. And basically, if most people in Arkansas are white, most people in Montana are white, there has been an appeal to white male voters who across the country who are not college educated and who are by a large majority for Mr. Trump, for example. That's why George Bush wore a cowboy hat and was from Texas. That's why Ronald Reagan was appealing to them as a cowboy from the Westerns, because the white male, the white uneducated male, especially in all the rural states that have very few people, still have an outsized voice in those states because they are the majority. And there's very few people of color. There's very few people who are not Christian or devout Christian. So that has pushed the Republican Party to become very heavily towards white men and the Democratic Party to be heavily for minorities. Or and the minorities now are becoming more and more the majority. And that's where you get complicated because the majority of people are voting Democrat, but the electoral states are keeping those states that are white majority to stay white majority and to be powerful with their electoral votes. So in some ways, we're watching a great power struggle between races and between identities, between Christian male dominated white versus black versus non-Christian versus or agnostic, and that's where these great struggles are happening. Is it difficult for a woman to crack that ceiling of becoming the leader of the country in the United States? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's amazing to me, for example, that Great Britain gave birth to the United States, and it's been comfortable for complicated reasons of royalty and monarchy. It's been comfortable with female leaders for a very, very long time. So an interesting, ironic legacy of monarchies is that they made people more comfortable with female leadership from time to time, due to the royal family maintaining their power structure through the occasional queen. So even though male hierarchy dominates the whole globe, from time to time, the monarchies or post-monarchies now were very comfortable with a female leader because they were used to it. But the United States has never had a female leader. There is no royal family. And so that is a big challenge for anybody who wants to be leadership. But again, 60 to 70% voted for Hillary. They will vote for they will vote for Kamala Harris. But there's an outsized space of electoral college, white male dominated spaces that have an outsized power to keep the electoral college from going to that majority. So this is why it's very complicated for a female leader. She also is African American, and again, the African American status is a status of division, in the sense that Mr. Obama ruled for 8 years as president. He was very popular with both white and black, but there was a certain portion of whites who said, for the first time in American history, there's an African American. And look where they swung. They swung towards an openly racist candidate who prides himself in disparaging the black community, and they openly ran for him right after 8 years of Mr. Obama. Kamala also is Asian background, and there's never been an Asian president. She also has a Jewish family, her husband and her children, and they actually openly practice both religions. So that's a challenge too, because Americans really favor, they ideally, the red states want a white male Protestant, as president, not a Mormon. There was a very strong candidate in a Mormon. There was a Mormon candidate in the Republican Party. He was wiped out. Mr. Biden is Catholic and very religious Catholic, and it's just discounted. It doesn't. This country had a strong anti-Catholic bias for a long time. Understandable legacies from Europe, in this struggle, but in the end of the day, she's facing a number of hurdles. Are those going to be determinative? If she was up against a nice Republican, moderate white Protestant, I think that the Electoral College would go against her. But right now, we have an amalgamation of people who are terrified of Mr. Trump, who are moving towards Mrs. Harris, and then there's because of the unprecedented situation, but because of disinformation, a lot of people just don't believe. They don't believe in their own family, cousins, family don't believe each other. It's an amazing psychological moment that we have to ask ourselves about in the age of information disinformation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And kind of to take a bit longer perspective, you mentioned the deficiency in the model. somehow to compare to other democracies where we have more than two-party system, for example, in Germany, in Italy, and many countries. Well, it has its own deficiency, but do you see long-term, let's say in 10, 15, 20 years, whether the American model can change and tolerate more than two parties? Because somehow, as you very well explained, the problem is in the bipolar political system. But also, whether do you say another change long term, not now, not in the next years, but to have the popular vote deciding who will be the US president. Like in most countries in the world, there is no electoral college, simply the candidate that gets most of there could be a second round, of course, there could be more than two candidates. So somehow to accept a different model, which might not have the same implications that you described. What do you think?
Well, I think the trend is going in that direction because with each election, the difference between the popular vote and the electoral vote is becoming more and more absurd. So it didn't used to be that way. They used to mirror each other a little bit closer. So as it becomes more absurd, there is more movement. And so a number of states, I think 196 electoral votes, are already saying we should go with the majority. And so those 196 electoral college votes, they already say we're going to go with the numbers but it's not up to 270 at this point. I think that's the trend of history. And and here's I want to say something bipartisan, and specifically bipartisan in this case, that I think Bernie Sanders, who was a left-wing politician who had a serious effect on the country, very, very left-wing, but he actually was much better at reaching across identities than the mainstream, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is making themselves less and less legitimate by only appealing in a partisan way to white uneducated men. It's just backing itself into a corner. The Democratic Party, in my opinion, has not done itself any favor by emphasizing identity-based politics, by emphasizing things for Black people, things for Jewish people, things for this minority and that minority. They're throwing away white votes. Bernie Sanders, who is personally both strongly Jewish background but also Catholic, Bernie emphasized economic issues. And my instinct is that there's going to be more and more third-party candidates that move away from identity-based politics. I think the younger generation is going to get tired of identity-based political thinking. And that also is going to move us away from the precipice of identity-based violence and identity-based fascism. We have to study comparative politics here. So when you study Africa, there's many different budding democracies, for lack of a better word. You start to see the flaws in all these transitions to democracy when you study what happens every few years when they have elections. Is that the real depth of democracy is the separation of an independent judiciary and human rights and civil rights. Those are the depths of it. Elections should not be so consequential every 4 years that every tribe or identity group considers it the beginning or the end of their power. And so you have places like Kenya, for example, where every 4 years there's radical violence and then everybody goes back to normal because there's a tribal struggle because one party is all one tribe and the other party is all three or four other tribes and they struggle. So it's like a civil war every 4 years. That's not ideal for the future of stability of democracy. And it's the same in the United States. There are tribes emerging, and those tribes are emerging as Democrat and Republican. as opposed to issues. And those Democrat and Republican are emerging more and more as white men versus everybody else. And that's not healthy either because it backs people into a corner. So I think that the younger generations have more and more integrated friendships. And my instinct is that they will be divided by issues, but they'll see identity-based divisions as more and more absurd. And I think with that, the Electoral College will also go. There's another reason why it might go. Just one more thing, and that is that we're running out of space. The real estate markets have made many middle class people almost homeless. There's an astrophysicist in Los Angeles who was at a prestigious UCLA astrophysics department. He's making 70,000 a year, and he is homeless. He's homeless. So when you have highly educated people homeless because of an absurd real estate situation, what you're going to see is a lot more movement to rural areas. And those rural areas are going to change their constitution, their complexion. That's what happened in Northern Virginia. Virginia was the home of the southern segregation, and it changed because of people moving for jobs. So I suspect that Arkansas and Montana are not going to be as isolated as we think in the future. People have to live somewhere. And I think that it's going to make it less and less a identity-based divisions, and the Electoral College is going to mean less and less. That's my prediction if we don't end up in a civil conflict.
I cannot agree more with this. Really, there must be a change, and there is no better time to anticipate the change when we see the crisis of this moment. And well, that kind of it reminds me the famous saying by Winston Churchill that democracy is not ideal, it's not perfect, but there is nothing better. And when you mentioned Kenya, it's quite interesting. As you said, elections produce violence every 4 years. And that's not a surprise because, in a way, elections are confrontational. I published a book on peace building, and it ended up by saying that in countries that experience long divisions, civil wars for many years, the first thing to do after the civil war is not an election, because election brings back the antagonism, the confrontation, the fight, the battle. For some period of time, possibly, it's good to have something like a round table agreement. And it happened, by the way, in Eastern Europe. After the communism, there were the first discussions were not to go immediately into election, which are confrontational, rather to look for compromising power sharing agreements for some time. Again, I agree this is maybe anti-democratic because normally we expect people to say who will be in government, but temporarily having power sharing agreements, and many African countries actually follow that model. Zimbabwe is one. Even in Kenya, we had that power sharing where the president is from one tribe, the prime minister is from another tribe. In other words, democracy needs to mature over time so that the elections represent not only the majority, but the other problem with the democracy and the election is that the party that wins 51% of the vote takes 100% of the power, and the party that gets 49%, almost half of the vote, gets zero power. And that also needs to be understood as a responsibility of the victor, of the winner of the elections, that victorious party needs to serve the entire population, not only the 51% which supported them. And that also requires some maturity, some political culture.
Yeah, and that's exactly. I mean, Europe has many experiments going on in the evolution of democracy in the former communist bloc. And one of the things, if you notice in Hungary and Poland, is that both times that it went towards less democracy, it was because of exploiting a rural community. and ignored rural environment. So, so people who are serious about democracy have got to stop ruling as a liberal elite that doesn't care about rural areas. Okay? They just can't do it anymore. We can't afford it. And just like you said, you can't afford a winner take all approach. So if people in Warsaw now are in charge, they had better pay attention to rural interests. If people are in if they want something beyond or Viktor Orban in Hungary eventually, liberal elites had better get to know people in the rural areas because it just can't continue that, more fascistic thinking is in the rural, just leave the rural lands or the bad lands of the what are they called, the Badlands of World War II. You just don't leave them to just fascistic
Bloodlands.
tendencies.
Timothy Snyder, the book by Timothy Snyder, Bloodlands. Yes.
Bloodlands. You just don't leave bloodlands to fascists.
Yes.
You have to engage people. There has to be conflict resolution. There has to be listening to people's needs, and that's the same and that's why technocrats matter. I think that the genius of the EU experiment has been that technocrats, by definition, are serving a very wide variety of interests. When we don't know what to do with this existential fight between Israeli identity and Palestinian identity, technocracy, the technocratic takeover of Gaza, for example, has always been an attractive model if there was more consensus and if all sides agreed to that. You would see a technocratic interest in rebuilding, in jobs, and so on. And it would not be an Israeli domination or an Arab
Absolutely.
domination. And, that would be more stabilizing. That's
I
it. It
wrote
would be more
about this in
stabilizing.
the past. I remember the United Nations transitional administrations, and they were massively in many parts of the Cambodia was in one example of UN taking over the bureaucracy, taking over the administration of a country after civil war until the local political parties mature to elections. East Timor was another example. So in the 1990s, we have transitional administrations from United Nations, and these are multilateral, unbiased, impartial administrations. And I'm really curious why the United Nations and Antonio Guterres as the Secretary General doesn't propose exactly the same for the situation in Gaza. I don't see how Gaza can be ruled by Israel. I don't see how Gaza can be ruled by Hamas
Right.
or by the Palestinians. It should be United Nations multilateral force, predominantly with the Arab countries. But there is no way. All discussions go what to do with Gaza, but they always go into somehow two-state solution, divisions,
Right, right,
and both sides disagree. In those
right.
situations, we need to have a bit of a creative thinking and bring, as you say, a bureaucracy from far away, just temporarily. Again, I understand this is
Right.
not perfect.
I want to, right. And I totally agree. I want to introduce a couple of other analytic skills that we're using. I have one book I have now is called Compassionate Reasoning. It's a combination of the higher use of reasoning with the human instincts in the brain, which are very sophisticated for compassion, for an understanding of the other, and then moral reasoning based on that. The other thing that we do a lot of is conflict healing, which appeals to multiple parts of the brain. So all of this is based on the new field of positive psychology. And positive psychology is revolutionary in terms of neuroscience. It's a focus on the future. It's a focus on planning. It's technocracy in some ways. How do you get from A to B? So let me give you some interesting statistics. We now, The Economist, has just recorded all the places where ballots are getting better and ballots are getting a little bit worse versus so that, for example, El Salvador, Bangladesh, Lithuania, Iceland are all their elections are less violent than they were the previous time. Um, but curiously, Croatia is a little bit worse. Portugal is a little bit worse than it was previous time. So we now can analyze where things are going right, positive psychology, and what are they doing that made it go better. So we have to study where democracy is getting stronger and why, and then copy that and apply that in other places. Where has democracy gone better? Get used to the social science of tracing democratic trends, like more or less violence around elections, and then study what did they do right, and then start to implement that. It's a combination of political science and social psychology, and I think neuroscience, and that's what I call conflict healing at this point. So the strategy of conflict healing amalgamates the different disciplines, but focuses on healing trends. And that's what I think democratic theory and practice needs to go to, which is not what the Democratic and Republican Party do. It is winner take all. I remember, I'm not going to say who, but I remember interviewing somebody who was the head of the Democratic Party in a certain state. I really admired what she was legislating. I'm partisan to it. And then I asked her, did you ever try to talk to farmers about this? And she looked at me like I was crazy. And she said, what would be the point? And my mouth dropped because I realized that she was in a different universe and she couldn't even imagine that she would try to explain her policies or go visit farms in her state. So this is the kind of mentality of so-called democracy that we need to overcome. It is a deeper form of democracy that does not consider any constituency to be a lost constituency, that considers every tribe and every identity worthy of engagement by a serious democratic leader. So it's an evolution of democratic psychology, if you think about it.
Yes, democracy, rule of people, rule by people, and rule for people. That's exactly what democracy means. Demos, people, and kratos, rule. But somehow, yes, you're absolutely right that elitist politicians often forget that. We have about less than 20 minutes
Yeah.
now. I want
May,
some
may I
other
may I make a little more comment and one more question? Okay, Dr. Gopin, as a Korean, many Korean people, we are very concerned about the Korean, the peninsula, the future situation, and uh, also the what our relations, of course, South Korea relations with the United States leadership. Okay, new leadership is also is very important. That's why I think many people also watch this the progress of this campaign and about the result, particularly the result who will be the elected as elected the president in the United States. And as your the title implies, understanding the process and the possible outcomes, outcomes. So my case, because we have here in South Korea, we have a freedom of expression. I mean, we can just I'm in favor of one candidate, because the policy or some approach or something. Frankly speaking, I'm in favor of the Kamala Harris. Okay, she's more multilateral approach, and the more humane approach. Also respect this environment problem, climate change or something. So how about the your opinion, Dr. Gopin? So the who do you expect to be the elect? I mean, you can you predict about this the result in the election?
I can't predict the results because
Uh-huh. Mm.
I don't know how much damage has been done
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
the ability of the system
Mhm.
to survive the
mm,
amount of manipulation, disinformation,
mm,
intimidation, and threats against vote counters that is going on in every part of the country.
mm,
So I am hoping
mhm,
that people I'm very depressed about the fact that I that that Miss Harris has to now we have to daily from a psychosocial point of view, we're all in Mr. Trump's universe now.
mm,
Instead of competing over issues, what he does is he lies so boldly every day
mm,
and repeatedly with the same lies. It's
mm,
classic fascism. That now everything that's coming out of the Harris camp is responding to Donald Trump's lies. So
mm,
the problem with that fascistic approach and what defeated Germany in 1930s is that you're always on your back legs defending yourself and using the name. So from a
mm,
psychosocial point of view and
mm,
an obedience point of view,
mm,
whoever gets repeated more, people get more obedient to.
mm,
So if every single post is about Trump, then people tend to vote that way. So I was hoping that she would move out of that sphere.
mm,
But what he did strategically was that he acts crazier and crazier to bring the attention back on him. And then every party and every candidate and every news agency is talking about him and his behavior and
mm,
what he just said.
mm,
And that's called gaslighting. It's very effective.
mm,
And many, many simple people who are in between, they're the ones making the decision on which way the electoral college is going to go.
mm,
So I'm nervous about the success of these fascistic methodologies.
mm,
Uh, it's possible that it could go the wrong way. And then I know that even if it doesn't go the wrong way, if it goes towards Miss Harris, it is going to be fought in every court in the country.
mhm,
And so we may end up with a civil conflict anyways,
mhm,
is what's quite possible. So I am I'm quite concerned, and I can't tell you what the outcome is going to be. I
mhm,
do think that there are. I also think there are mistakes that have been made by this is you asked for the origins of all of this too. I cannot not mention the fact
mhm,
that as as justified as Ukraine has been
mhm,
in defending itself from an outrageous invasion of its territory, an outrageous abduction of their children, and so many terrible things. The fact is that we have learned time again in the 20th century that you can't that there are large non-democratic countries that you cannot think that with just a little bit more technology you can overwhelm them,
mhm,
and that there has to be a political way to reintroduce an agreement between Russia and Europe and the United States on how to live together, because that toxicity, the toxicity of alternative forms of warfare, has successfully undermined the stability of the United States. It has done more to the United States than the KGB ever dreamed it could in the Cold War. In the Cold War, the KGB had, you know, a few spies here and there. They stole a lot of information. They never did to this country what Mr. Putin has succeeded in doing to the United States. And we have to ask ourselves whether it's in anybody's interest to fight to the death for every piece of territory in Ukraine instead of there being a full NATO embrace of half of Ukraine or two-thirds of Ukraine, and finally putting Russia back on a footing where there's negotiation. It's the same in Asia. It is impossible to dream of getting rid of very large non-democratic states. It's wrong. It doesn't work out well in history. And so we need a president. So I'm saying that on one level, I trust Ms. Harris to stabilize the world more, but I think that the Democratic leadership has got to have a much more robust engagement with powers that be, from Saudi Arabia all the way to Russia, all the way to China, in order for us to survive the age of disinformation. Democracies are vulnerable to disinformation. We can educate ourselves, but in the end, there is no golden dome around us in free countries that will allow us to survive this level of onslaught. We need to coexist just like we needed in the Cold War. This is not about nuclear Armageddon, but it's about the destruction from within of democratic societies. And we can't do that when we're in a state of full warfare. So I think that it begs, the situation begs for more diplomacy, more rational relationships between the Koreas, as difficult as, I mean, you see North Korean troops in Ukraine. That's an astonishing escalation that is very dangerous to South Korea when you think about it. And we need these things to go back to stable competitions and negotiations for the stability of Asia, the stability of Europe, and the internal stability of our countries that are, and that's one thing we need. And the other thing we need is like Warren Buffett said, we need billionaires who know when enough is enough, and that it's okay to be a billionaire. It's not okay to try to destroy politics so that you can have freedom to do anything you want without any law governing you. And that's another limit that we're reaching as a global civilization. That is a very, very important moment. None of this is pure liberal or pure conservative. When you think about it, it's all about bipartisan approach to stability. So, do I think that we're getting better at this? Is Miss Harris better at dealing with this than Biden was or Clinton was? Yes, there is a better ability to see what's happening, and she's better at dealing with his personality. But I still don't think, I still worry about the average voter and whether the elites understand that, as the Professor Vaseline said, we cannot win by majority take all. Nobody can be victorious by the majority takes everything. It just is not, it's not even real democracy. And it's certainly not global stability. And that's true in Ukraine as well. Ukraine was part of Russia. Russia was part of Ukraine. We have to face that, and we have to have them de-escalate in order for us to survive, and go back to more global stability.
Thank you, Mark. That reminds me very well something I wrote back 20 years ago, that democracy is not about majority. Democracy is about minority and how we treat minority, but also democracy is not to take the power. In the opposite way, democracy is about to give the power to the people, to the rural communities, to all communities to be ruled. So somehow we need to reformulate what democracy is. It's not about majority, it's not about to take the power. I see Miki Oishi wants to ask questions. So please, my good friend Miki Oishi, your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor Popovsky, and also thank you, Professor Agbo and Gopin, for your very comprehensive discussion on this important issue. How do I say? I think I understand what you say, but sorry to say, I feel we are living in two different worlds between your world and my world. I'm sorry to say, and of course, and each of us are entitled to how to understand, how to interpret, and what is happening. Of course, you of course, much more, maybe 1,000 times more, where birth, know what's happening in the US than myself, right? Of course. But the other things, maybe I want to raise maybe 3 issues. Now it's not much time left. Sorry, but maybe first thing is that from the Asian perspective, during the the Trump, President Trump first term as a U.S. president, I feel that he has done and he did a lot to create peace in Northeast Asia. Maybe, as you know, he made a very great contribution to bring the two Koreas, right? And for the dialogue. And then I still remember, and I attended this History NGO Forum and meeting in Korea in maybe 2016. I think at that time, Trump was kind of threatening to do something against North Korea. Then I was attending that conference. I was a bit worried about that, but also I felt there's something maybe coming. Then soon after that, Trump suddenly decided to meet with Kim Jong-un, right? And also the Trump also brought in at the president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, right? And then the three of them and shake hands among themselves. At that time, I felt the long-lasting Korean War was finally coming to an end. With the contribution of Trump. Of course, there is a huge effort by the president and Moon Jae-in at that time, of course, but somehow. So I think there's no more, the national border, no longer tension, whatever. But of course, there are some unfortunate things, unfortunate turn of the events, and then now again the tension return to the previous time. Now even stronger, tension even higher than before currently, right? Because of the maybe I don't know and which side began first, and but anyway, the tension very high. But during the Trump period. And
Mikhail, can you formulate the question? Because yes.
Okay. This is one thing. Yeah. So for me, I have maybe a more positive impression of President Trump. Yeah, and hopefully he will maybe revive the peace process in in Korean Peninsula. Second one is the disinformation in the U.S. Japanese main media kind of copying what is reported in the US, and like CNN and Fox News or ABC, CBS, whatever. Then according to that, Trump is definitely the bad guy, totally. So this one is heavily reflecting what the US mainstream media is doing in the US. Then, because of that, many Japanese people feel very negative perception of Trump. And this is what you already explained. Yeah, exactly. Many Japanese people feel like that. Trump is a fascist and totalitarian and racist and all these things. Yeah. But I have maybe some different perspective. But I don't want to go into detail because there's lack of time. So, but anyway, I think that under increasing these days, certain group of politicians, certain people are now rethinking and re-examining this established image of Trump. Yeah? So I want to inform you of this situation. And maybe you will not agree with me. And the third one is the question. Of course, Tulsi Gabbard, right? Tulsi Gabbard, and she was the former, and representative, right, and the House of Representatives, Tulsi Gabbard. She used to be the Democrat, right, and then she kind of resigned, right, And then now she is supporting Trump. Yeah, and although her original background is a Democrat, and also she is a Hindu. She is a Hindu, and also she has a Pacific Island origin. Yeah? She is a kind of the Pacific Islander, not white and or Anglo-Saxon. But now she has a very, very negative image about Kamala Harris. And actually, during the previous presidential election, not this time, also she also ran for the presidential post, right? And then, as I see it, she kind of demolished Kamala Harris candidacy for the president quite some time ago, maybe 4 years ago. And he gave a very good reason why Kamala Harris is unfit for the president. And I'm not going to that, but of course you know it. So so I would like to ask you, how do you understand, well, what is the perception of Tulsi Gabbard? This is my question.
Thank you, Mikio. Now back to Marc. Yes.
Yeah, I just say it briefly in the interest of time. I've never heard of her. So honestly, what I pay attention, no, what I pay attention to is over 100 officials in the Trump administration and in the Republican Party, Vice President Cheney, and all the former presidents of the country, the former Joint Chiefs of Staff, over 100 military leaders of the United States, all saying that Trump is a dangerous man who should never be president. 100 Republican officials are voting for Kamala Harris. And so I don't know if this is not about CNN saying that Trump is a bad guy. This is about an unprecedented consensus among the Republican and Democratic leadership that are retired that what the active party did was a gross mistake and that he is a very, very dangerous man. Kamala Harris has all the qualifications to be president. She has been a lifelong, she's been a vice president, she's been a senator, and she's been an attorney general and a prosecutor. And she has an unblemished reputation in terms of anti-corruption, whereas Mr. Trump is involved in he's a convicted felon. He was convicted by the United States, despite millions of dollars of his defense team, in 31 counts of federal crimes. He's involved in thousands of cases that still could put him in jail. And I don't think that's CNN. I think that's the facts. Now, the fact that somebody admires the North Korean dictator and says he likes dictators in general, and the fact that he has billions of dollars invested in China, and he decides things based on where he thinks he'll make the most profit. Okay, so he suddenly is an admirer of the North Korean leader, and the North Korean leader seems to like people who like him. And so he developed this moment in which he did what a bully does. He threatened the Korean peninsula, he threatened the alliances, and then he said, let's be friends. So when you are an absolute leader and you don't listen to anybody but yourself, there's flexibility in diplomacy. Do I think, as a conflict analyst and resolution specialist, that the democratic leadership and the military leadership should be as flexible as possible in Asia with North Korea and with Japan and South Korea? Absolutely. Explore all options. Go deeply into personal relationships. Don't get trapped in old problems. There's many ways in which democratic leadership and military leadership could be more creative with enemy systems in the world. But if all of that is at the expense of a fascistic criminal leader being in charge of the nuclear codes, who wanted the United States military to shoot demonstrators, unarmed demonstrators on the streets of Washington, then no, we can't say, objectively speaking, that this is a safe option because he happened to have had some moment between the North Korean and South Korean leader. I am perfectly ready as a student of politics to acknowledge these moments when he may have had a personal relationship with somebody that worked better than the current impasses. That's great to talk about. But in every other way, he is incompetent and dangerous and a criminal. And that's not CNN talking to Japanese people. That is the conclusion of historians and leaders across the aisle. And we can go through quotes on all of them about that. So it is so I respect your analysis of the failure of us to get around systems in terms of the Korean crisis. I respect that. But let's get there with a safer person.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, Marc.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your view on this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miki Oishi. We are running out of time. I wonder if someone has a brief question to Marc, or shall we thank him for this brilliant presentation today. I personally learned a lot. I would like to read some of your publication. We definitely want you to stay with us in the group and to be our guest again as a speaker. As you know, Sunho is convening those meetings every Thursday, so depend on your time and availability. We will be very happy to meet you again and to talk probably on issues of conflict resolution, where it's your kind of a strongest expertise. And we want to discuss specific conflicts and how this can be resolved. So that's all from me. Sunho, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Popovsky, okay, my friend, okay, for your service. And today's speaker, Dr. Marc Gopin, thank you indeed, okay, for your participation and for your wonderful presentation, your talks, discussion too, okay. And as Dr. Popovsky says, it's my hope that would like to invite you to another topic, conflict resolution between South Korea and North Korea. Okay, it's a very big topic. Okay, so it's a really big issue, and we think democratic system is the most advanced or something as a system, but there are many, there's some faults. I mean the problems. Okay, and it's somewhat very have the same experience in Korea. Like we have major parties and minorities always like finding fault with each other. Okay, so sometimes. We are as voters or also all these citizens, they are very confused, like disinformation, particularly like through this like YouTube or online. Okay, we are very confused. So I think the the judgment is very important. Okay, based on the fact. This is important. Okay, thank you for your joining and all other members. And it's a pity that we could more friends to join us, could join us in our discussion. And we hold our this forum and mostly 2 weeks, like bi-weekly. But this time our next forum 3 weeks later, okay, is November 7th, and the topic is another topic. We turn to Asian issue like Myanmar and Burma. Okay, Burma issue, as you know, is another conflict resolution. Okay, conflict transformation. Our regular member, Dr. Myo-in from Myanmar. He's now doing research in the United States. Okay, so he volunteered to be a speaker. So I will announce it, and I will invite our all network members. So we'll hope to see you November 3rd. And I should close. And Christelle, thank you again for your cooperation. And instead, I'll promote your George Mason and the Carter Center, your program, okay? Sharing
No,
your notice.
call it Carter School because the Carter Center is in Atlanta.
Okay.
It's the Carter School, Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School,
Right, Jimmy Carter.
which is part integrated into the George Mason University.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And have a nice trip. Okay, Crystal, have a nice time.
Well, and Marc is also you're in Boston
Yeah,
and
right.
in Massachusetts.
Boston, right.
And I'm in the neighbor state in New York, the state of New York.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. And so stay healthy and okay, have a wonderful time. And the other members, our regular members, and you can stay healthy and hope to see you. Okay. November 7th. Okay. Up to late. Okay, everybody. Okay. Thank you for
Bye-bye.
joining
Thank you,
us.
Marc.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take good care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.